welcome to Picture Me Coding. My name is Erik and my co-host is Mike Mull. Hello, Mike.
Hey there.
Last week you mentioned a band called The Tubs and a music video around the band and their album, and I loved listening to this. I was glad that you brought it. I felt like I was transported back to the 90s and I wanted to go through the same time machine those guys on the cover of their record went through with those like 1991 clothes. I just wanted to go right back to where they were. And I love the music video you mentioned. It was hilarious and the music was great. It was fun, life affirming music. I really liked it.
Yeah, he plays a very convincing Lyft driver.
The energy vampire.
Yeah, you almost get the impression he's just being a Lyft driver and somehow filming it. So it was a really well produced video.
What have you been listening to this week?
This week, there's a new album out from the band The Clientele. The album is called I Am Not There Anymore. In 2017, they came out with an album. I think it's called Music for the Age of Miracles, which was the first I'd ever heard of them. Um, Apparently, they were like critical darlings of the indie world going back to the late 90s, early 2000s, but I had really not heard of them until that 2017 album. I liked that album a lot, but the critical reception was kind of meh. Um, this one I think is even better, and it's been getting pretty good reviews. It's a double album. I'm not sure that term really makes sense in the modern world, but it's a lot of songs, and I think there's a little bit more variety to them. They're kind of hard to classify. They're one of those bands where they seem to have. It sounds both familiar in the sense that you can sort of pick up influences from '60s pop and maybe '80s indie bands, but they're also somehow singular.
Hmm.
Um,
I noticed you mentioned that album to me, and I noticed a lot of strings. I was surprised by the strings, cello, violin.
yeah, there's a lot of strings. This is definitely more on the pop side than on the rock and roll side, but I also noticed they use the strings in quite a few songs as uh, more of the rhythm section than sweeping melodies and that kind of thing. So I'm really enjoying this album. Lots of really strong songs and some interesting departures.
I,
Um,
I
there's a
remember the 2017 album you mentioned, and I kind of liked it. I kind of feel the same way about this one. I haven't listened to it much. You just mentioned it, so I listened to it a couple times. There's like some sort of energy that I kind of want maybe a little more of, but I think I need to hear it a few more times to know.
I think it works out as good work music because it's the vibe of it is pretty mellow and um, it's not something where you are getting lots of heavy dynamics that sort of interrupt your thinking.
Hmm.
But
Yeah.
the lyrics are also pretty interesting. So if you do just want to sort of put on the headphones and listen close, it's also pretty compelling.
Hmm. Okay. Well, I guess I'll give it another listen. I've been listening to "I Walked with You a Ways" a lot again. I learned about that album at the beginning of this year. That's the collaboration called Planes from Waxahachie, and Jess Williamson. I'm pretty sure you had heard that one. I mentioned to you a while ago, and you said, "Oh yeah, I've heard that." Um, I loved Waxahachie's Saint Cloud. I kind of wore that one out. I listened to it over and over and over again. And you told me about that one too. I just absolutely loved that album. It was like this soul healing syrup, just pour it on me, please. Things are weird out there in the world. Just pour this nice edifying feeling on top of me every day. There's a song on the first song on that album, "I Walk with You a Ways," is called Summer Sun. And there's this line in there, and I sometimes I have this thought where people talk about desert island music, and I think of like desert island lyrics, like little lyrics. You just put them on a strip of paper and stuff it in your pocket and keep it with you forever. And Katie Crutchfield, who goes by the name Waxahachie, she sings, "And I cook for you as a good woman do." And there's something about that line. It's like this really dry joke. It speaks multitudes. There's this I am not like this, but we can pretend for a bit and have a good time. But this relationship is probably not going to work. And I told you it wasn't going to work. We can sort of put on these clothes and pretend that we can live up to these expectations that generations before had for us, all the weight they put on us. Um, she just seems like a fun person to hang out with, just like sardonic, smart, sarcastic, but also a little like kind of hard to pin down, one of those people. She's going to do what she wants to do. And it comes across in that line. I just love that line. There's another song on there called Hurricane, and they have these really nice vocal harmonies. I do feel a little guilty though when I listen to this album because I sort of treat it like another Waxahachie album. The ones where it's more Jess Williamson stuff, I tend to not like as much. um, there's another weird thing about Waxahachie, which is, I have to cop to singing along in the car to stuff that I like, and I absolutely cannot sing along to her stuff. It's like I just sound horrible. Like I'm trying to color between the lines, and I just cannot. Like I'm coloring out all over the place. I don't know what it is about her voice, but she like curls the edges of words around, like burning paper curls up or something, and I just cannot go. Her voice does these things I really like. So she sounds very mature, but like she's addressing things that are kind of tough about relationships in her life, and she has this wise but fun voice. I really really love it. So I'm gonna listen to that album again, and it does have that similar type of I like soul healing feeling that I really like.
I did listen to it a lot when it came out. I am a huge Waxahachie fan. In fact, I like pretty much everything the Crutchfield sisters have done. Um, I really enjoyed the album as well. I think we had a discussion about it at the time that there's one particular song on the album that got on my nerves slightly because of the varied mispronunciations of a
Oh yeah,
particular word.
yeah, yeah.
Um, I don't know why it bothers me, and maybe it's an OCD thing or something. But um, yeah, other than that, I really enjoyed the album too.
I
Very,
want to say last week I mentioned fiddles. Fiddles scare me a bit because then I might be listening to country music. But banjos are okay. Thumbs up banjos.
yeah, I think I would disagree with you on that point in the sense that
Banjos not okay. Fiddles good.
no, I think banjos are totally acceptable. Um, Sufjan Stevens, I think, kind of kind of brought them over the hump into the indie world.
Okay,
But
that's why it's okay for me because I am listening to indie rock. They got banjos. Banjos are my bridge to country music.
yeah, but I not sure that I agree with you on the fiddle thing.
I just think fiddle like, I don't know. We're gonna let snakes bite us and drink turpentine and stuff.
Yeah,
Okay, maybe that's
I
too far. That goes too
that's
far.
it's definitely a bluegrass instrument, but it's also a classical instrument. So
Yeah, that's true. All right, that was probably too judgy. We'll probably have to cut that one out. You you brought a question this week, I think, right?
yeah, so a couple of things have come across my screens lately. One is a New York Times article that you had pointed me at about how studios in Hollywood are trying to turn the production of movies and TV, other sorts of content into an assembly line process. Um, the idea makes very little sense to me. I don't know how that would actually work. I don't know enough about that industry, but it did get us talking about whether or not that's applicable to what we do. A second inspiration here was a book that I was reading called The Perfectionists by Simon Winchester. The theme of that book is more generally about precision engineering and how over the last few centuries that's become more and more things have become more and more precise and have smaller and smaller tolerances.
That sounds like an interesting topic all on its own. But and I think I would They're like I immediately think of like Hillel Wayne doing his piece about whether or not software engineers are quote unquote true or real engineers. But actually, I wanted to ask, how does precision engineering relate to assembly lines?
So that's kind of the key point. The one of the one of the points he makes in the book is that manufacturing things to specified tolerances was sort of an important prerequisite to being able to build assembly lines for making complex objects. I believe it kind of started in the world of manufacturing rifles, flintlocks to be specific, but obviously was sort of perfected and is most is best known as uh, being done by Henry Ford to build cars. And the idea is that each step in the process is adding a new part, and so all of those parts need to be interchangeable. So they need to be able to go on any car, which means that to do this efficiently, you can't grab a file and file down a rough edge or something. You need to have a piece of a component that is manufactured to tolerances such that you can just add it to the vehicle, add it to the assembly,
Hmm.
and move it on to the next step. So
Is precision correlated with the ability to assembly line explode a thing, a process? Like the more precise you go, that means the more kind of explosion you can go, or is it not so simple?
I think to a certain extent that's true, but I think it's more a case of, if I have a part that I'm adding at a particular step in the line, any part that I grab, say I have a bin full of those parts, any one that I grab should be able to go on the car and suffice.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Similarly, if the car breaks, you should be able to take that part off and replace it with another one that will fit. And so ultimately, both of these, the New York Times article and the book, sort of led us to this idea of, can software be built on an assembly line? Um, so I think what we're talking about is a series of steps that are assembling a complex thing where a new part, a new component is added at each of those steps.
It sounds like a question designed to really provoke me.
Good. You're interesting when provoked.
Well, okay, so my first response to this question is, I mean, the immediate software engineer's response is no, no, you can do that, right? But then the question is why? If you really can't turn software into assembly line type of production, why? To me, why couldn't you is an interesting question itself. But the first thing that occurs to me is I think of assembly lines as things or ways of building things that are infinitely reproducible, like a car, right? You design a car and then you want to produce millions of them.
Yeah. And I think that's the immediate objection that most people would have, is that an assembly line is something designed to optimize producing a lot of copies of one type of thing, whereas software building is, by its nature, building a single copy of something. Obviously, in certain types of delivery systems, you might make other copies and ship them to people, but it's really the process of building the first copy, which is the hard part. I think there is perhaps, though, I don't think we could dismiss the idea totally out of hand because of that. I think, another key feature of the assembly line is there's sort of a process control to it now. So there are statistical methods to see how long that step in the process is taking, and is that is that something that can be improved. You're saying you're keeping records of, are there components that don't work and what percentage of those components fail and that kind of thing. So even if you even if you don't use the exact analogy of an assembly line to to build multiple copies of something, you still have this idea of a series of steps where you have certain controls put in place.
I want to go deeper on that, but I still am sort of mystified by comparing building a car to building some software application because the question that then comes up to me is if I think, well, it seems like it would work if it's infinitely reproducible. And then I suddenly think, well, I don't think I've ever built the same thing twice. Maybe that's not true. Maybe I have built the same, but that seems like a problem. Like, why do I build something completely novel every single time? Is that, and maybe that's not worth exploring. I
No,
want to build the same thing.
I think that is worth exploring. I think that's really kind of an important part of this. Is so it would it would not be sensible to build the exact same application over and over again from scratch. But for example, in our current situation, for instance, we might build several different web apps. They have different function, but they have a lot of the same backbone. They use third party frameworks in the same way. They have similar architectures. So is there a is there an assembly line process to be applied to those common parts? I think is maybe a worthwhile question. And I think there's also sort of a question of, are we already doing this in a certain sense?
Hmm. Yeah, I kind of wondered that too. It sort of bothers me that I seem like I'm always building something different. People show up to me sometimes at work with totally novel requests, and they'll say, "Hey, you built this thing, and it does this, and I want a new thing that does this, and it sounds very much like this old thing. Can we get the old thing to do it?" And the answer is almost always no. We built the old thing without even understanding that you would show up with this completely new request. It doesn't have anything to do with the new request. Yeah, it kind of looks abstractly like it's solving the same problem, but I can't shoehorn it into this thing. I would like to because then I could just go to the beach, right? I could just reuse what I already built.
Yeah, well, and there's this certain sense in which I think the industry at the moment is sort of resistant to building things that have functionality that's too broad. The microservice approach kind of lends itself to being as specific as possible. And the only cases where you can sort of do things broadly are where you have really good abstractions that where you can get different shades of things to fit into the same abstractions.
Yeah. I guess I wonder, like, is that like maybe an architect? I know a guy who he's an architect, he works in an architecture firm. He designs schools. And schools but they're like public schools. So cities and counties come to them with a new site and they want to build schools and playgrounds and things. And I imagine it's pretty similar. It's like every school is suited to the site that it's on, so they all have their kind of niche or unique constraints. But you're still building classrooms and you're still building bathrooms and things. You can kind of reuse some of these abstractions. But I imagine it's still from the ground up every single time. I was interested that you brought up web applications because that to me seems like shouldn't the web is pretty solved problem, building websites, building data driven web applications. We've been doing that for 20, 30 years. And you said maybe we already have divided up the labor. Do you have examples of what you were thinking of when you said that?
A couple of things come to mind. One is that most organizations now, ours also, have people who specialize in certain parts of the application. So we have people who are focused on front end, we have people who are focused on back end. I guess arguably we have people who are focused on things like database design, and we have DevOps specialists whose job is primarily to move completed components into a cloud environment or do integrations. And to a certain extent, those things do happen in parallel, but there's also a little bit of a staging where one part has to exist before the next part can be worked on. So it may not be a perfect parallel to manufacturing assembly line, but it does feel a little bit like, you know, there's less and less of the full stack developer that there was 10 years ago who was taking things from inception to completion.
Hmm, interesting. Well, and you could add QA to that too, right? The people who are assigned to testing the applications that are built. So you almost can't imagine like a pipeline. Back end person, front end person. Front end person is display and user interaction, client side stuff. Back end is talking to databases and preparing data and getting things ready for the front end. You got QA, you got a deployment person. But you said this is a little this specialization you see it growing lately. Um, didn't these types of specializations, front end, back end, sysadmin for deploying, that existed 20, 30 years ago, right?
My belief is that it existed to a lesser extent. You know, in 2009, let's say, I was writing jQuery and Python and doing SQL, and felt at that time that I could write a an end-to-end web application, using existing frameworks. And I was comfortable calling myself a full stack person. At this day and age, I I don't have a great familiarity with the current JS frameworks. I've done a little bit with React, but certainly not expert and certainly not super motivated to become expert. At this point, I would consider myself primarily a back end person with probably above average database skills. But yeah, my belief is that from the last 10 to 15 years, specialization in those areas has become more the norm than it was previously.
Yeah, I guess I wonder about that. It does seem like there are orgs that want full stock engineers, right? People who can do it all. And I sort of lean in your direction. I wonder if that's less common now than it used to be, as the complexity of front end has grown and the complexity of back end has grown and the complexity of possibly deploying stuff has grown. And I also kind of wonder about the motivations of organizations that want full stack engineers. So it's maybe like an assembly line thinking there, right? Like if I have someone who can contribute anywhere, then I can pick them up at the beginning of the assembly line and move them to the end if I need some more people to work there. So the people become, this is a little bit of a pejorative reading, but they become widgets, worker units. We just sort of flush them around.
They're fungible. Um, yeah, I don't know if that's. I suppose that's probably common on manufacturing assembly lines too. I am speaking from a position of ignorance, I'm afraid, but I would assume that you would want to have each station in the manufacturing assembly line not to be too specialized to a certain sort of individual so that you could move them around. But I do not know for sure.
Well, I don't want to derail what your questions here, but I also feel like I usually don't know what I'm going to build in advance. There's this weird process of discovery involved in building software. Somebody comes to me with a request, and I can only satisfy the request by starting on it and seeing what I need to do next.
I think that's true insofar as the functionality, the requirements of the project are true. But again, it's not like every time we start a project, we invent a novel architecture
That's true.
or create a new language or build a new database. There's certain pieces that are going to be in that system. It's not quite to the point, I don't think, of the construction trade. I've had a couple of uh, remodeling projects done, and I'm always impressed by how well they are able to estimate the cost. But I think some of that is because they know the steps and they are able to extrapolate the new project from prior projects. So
That's
pouring a foundation, they know that it's roughly a certain amount per square foot. They know roughly how many square feet they're going to need for your project, and so they can they can make a decent estimate of how much that stage is going to cost.
that's a nice motivating analogy. Maybe we're just really crappy at this stuff. And maybe to give ourselves an out, we just haven't been doing it for that long. Construction's been around as a field for quite a long time.
I think the common objection to the metaphor, to the comparison with construction, is that, well, it's the entire motivating thing for Agile, right? We don't really know what the software is supposed to do in a precise enough way. The people who are building an addition on your house probably do have a pretty good sense of what the finished product should look like, even though it's different from projects they've done before in certain ways. But in our profession, I think the idea is that we're typically not experts in the domain. So there's going to be this process of figuring out with the domain experts what the thing actually has to do.
Hmm.
So, we know how to build databases, we know how to make database schemas, but we don't actually know what that schema should look like until we understand the function of the product, which is why we need this iterative process of making a good attempt, putting it in front of the customer and getting feedback.
So that's interesting. So it's like we're creating a novel functional machine every time. It's like a Rube Goldberg machine. If you were to hire a construction crew to build you a Rube Goldberg machine, maybe that's a better analogy for what we do at work all day with software building.
Maybe. I think I think there's a counter argument, which is that we as a profession are bad at specifying things.
Oh yeah, why is it so hard? Well, you mentioned agile too, which I was interested in because I thought when you mentioned this question about assembly line, I thought, well, that's where lean, right, development principles of Kanban come from, and agile is inspired. All these things are work process movements in our field where they're trying to make it so that the work is performed efficiently, and our work widget unit is often a ticket on a ticketing system. Implement X. And here's how you know that you've completely implemented X. And then we have to produce the work that does the thing. And so there's all this debate about how to efficiently funnel work to the workers, in this case, developers. So Agile is one example where we might start building a few pieces of a thing and then decide to change it. So we want to be agile. And Kanban is we'll have this giant bucket of tickets and people will pull the next one when they're ready, just like Toyota manufacturing. You pull your pieces off for your assembly line, and when your cart is empty, you roll it back to where it came from and you get a new cart. And contrast this with waterfall, where it's like somebody says, here's your design, and then they pass it to the next person who starts implementing the design. I guess I these often feel like really imperfect analogies for, we use them as motivators for how we're going to organize our work, but it always feels like this sort of thing that we're shoehorning ourselves into as a metaphor for manufacturing. Seems like this conversation really is in the same vein.
Maybe I do think there's sort of something fundamentally different in that. I think with an assembly line, you want a process where, when you complete step 3, you know that you can move on to step 4 and it's probably not going to come back to you. Again, having never worked on an actual assembly line, I'm making a lot of assumptions here. But, I do believe that the the idea behind that sort of operation is that you you want it to go from beginning to end fairly smoothly, and you can keep data on it and apply statistical process control, but you know what the final product is going to look like, so there's never a situation where you have to go back to previous steps and redesign the engine block or something.
So I have two questions for you, and I'm not sure which one to ask first. One of the questions is your gut sense that software could be built on an assembly line and we just haven't discovered the right way to do it yet?
My personal sense is probably no. It cannot be built on an assembly line in the strict sense that it is done in manufacturing processes.
Hmm.
My second belief, I guess, is that we probably could do a lot better job in terms of assembling software if we spent more time on formalization of the specifications, formalization of the way that things fit together, um, maybe a little bit more formalization in our CI/CD pipelines to make sure that we're doing the right things and testing the right things.
So maybe if things weren't so fuzzy in terms of how a backend, like HTTP, we talked about web, like a web server is normally implemented. It's very fuzzy. If we just sort of strictly said we're going to conform to these paradigms for querying databases, and we're always going to have interfaces, data that looks in a certain way. Maybe you do the same thing for the front end. Maybe you do the same thing for your database. Is that what we're missing? Like extreme specification, precision that everybody agrees on? That's what you started with, precision?
I think so. My closest analogy that I've been able to come up with for an idea of precision in software, and this I know this will make you happy, is sort of formal method stuff in particular, like perhaps better type specifications, better protocol specifications, um, where applicable, things like model checking and proofs.
Hmm,
Um,
that's interesting.
I think there's also perhaps some things about the way we build software that we need to rethink a little bit. So, in bringing up this idea of assembly line to some people, the immediate response I get is, well, we're already using off the shelf parts because we have all these third party libraries and we have REST APIs that we can use from third parties.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one response I have to that from, previous study of cost models and things like that is that that may not always be the best idea. There are cases where we are taking a third party library and incorporating it into our systems, but to do so, we have to build adapters to make the API that they have look like the
Mm-hmm.
API that we want.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there are also cases where the third party thing that we're picking out of a bin is, we're using maybe 10% of it, and the other 90% is essentially just adding complexity and taking up space.
Yeah, I've seen that before. That's what always frustrates me with build or buy. It's like, okay, we're going to buy. Okay, but how much work do I still need to do to make the bot thing work with whatever junk that we already have? I guess I wonder too, we're talking about specification and precision. We talked about web. In web with the front end back end, you get a lot of HTTP servers that are returning JSON. They're using RESTful practices. These are pretty generally agreed on. If you just sort of committed to that, and a lot of people have, maybe that stuff gets a lot easier. You just sort of start generating it, from like people do Swagger. You start generating stubs and things. You generate code. Maybe what ends up happening is not assembly line so much as we just sort of get the code to write code for us. But actually, that's a bit of a weird like dream wander that I just did. Um, the question that I had when I had two questions, maybe if we talk about assembly line and exploding things, dividing up the labor, maybe the thought experiment we want is have we just not exploded it far enough? And I'm going to give you an example that just sort of maybe it's a dystopian example, but if you imagine an assembly line of software developers, maybe there's someone who creates a file and just has like function names in there. And it says these functions need to call each other in this order, something like that. And then they pass it to the next person. And the next person implements a function. And then they pass it to the next person. The next person implements a function, and then maybe somebody does a test, and so on. Is this like horribly dystopian, sounds god awful way to work? Or is this in the direction of actually building an assembly line?
Well, offhand, it does sound like waterfall. Um,
Exactly. Yes. That's how it sounds to me too. Yes.
you you probably aren't most
Too
people
young. Too
most
young,
people
yes.
probably aren't old enough to remember the days when that's very nearly exactly what we did. You know,
Right. And I
somebody
hear
would,
people loved it.
yeah, that's why it was so successful and
Exactly.
lives to this day. Um, yeah, I mean, when I started out, people would spend 6 months writing a spec before they wrote a line of code. And even then, I think people knew that it wasn't a great idea. You know, this was the late 80s. And, so it was 20 years after Fred Brooks had said, write one to throw away because you will anyway.
Mm.
So,
They should have learned his lessons, is what you're saying.
yeah,
Mythical Man Month writer, Fred Brooks. The more people
yeah,
you
they,
add to a software project, the slower it'll go.
yeah, I think people had not learned the lesson even then that even even though I think a lot of people did prototype sort of informally without necessarily being sanctioned to do it, there was the official process was we're going to write a spec and then we're going to heave that document over the wall to the engineers who are going to write some code and then they're going to throw that code onto some system that the QA people can only touch and etc.
Yeah. I mean, I had, that was my thought when you raised this. It's like, didn't they try this and decide they hated it? We're just sort of creative flower children, you know? I'm going to go off in my little cave and I'm going to write my poetry. And then I will tell you when it's ready. Don't come in before it's ready.
I look forward to visiting your poetry cave. That sounds fun. But the reason why I think it fell out of fashion is not because of the stepwise procedure necessarily. It was because it's very difficult to spend 6 months writing a specification for something
Mm.
without having things change in those intervening 6 months. I think you and I both also agree that sometimes writing software is the only way you can understand the requirements and how the software should fit together. But the the agility thing I think was came around for two reasons. One is because it is impossible to anticipate the requirements of a system before you write code, and also because you don't spending time writing documents is time you're not spending building systems.
Mm. Yeah, I read once, I can't remember where I read it, but that software development is a discovery process. You never know at the beginning what you would have wanted to know at the end.
Probably true, although I am on the fence about whether or not that's a good thing.
Yeah, me too. Yeah. I would love to know in advance. It seems like the job would get so much easier.
The missing part has always seemed to me to be some way to understand what the system is supposed to do in an unambiguous way.
Mm. Is a
And
requirements gathering problem? Is that what that is? Or is that too simple of a statement?
it's a requirements gathering problem, it's a requirements specification problem, it's probably a little bit of a communication problem. There's these classic examples of how even the users who are expert at their in their field may not really understand what they want the software to do,
Mm.
and so it's difficult for them to communicate that. Maybe it's an unsolvable problem, maybe it has to be a back and forth type of thing,
Mm.
and software will always have this craftsman aspect to it where you have to adjust and adapt. I don't know, but it does seem to me like it seems like we could do better, and also that there's not a lot of willpower to do better at this point in history. The
It's like one of the frustrating but also beautiful things about our field. Well, like if you go back to my school building example, it'd be pretty annoying if you spent 2 years building a school and you've got, kindergarten and first grade over here, and you've got fourth grade and fifth grade over here, at opposite ends of a school building. You build the thing, people come in, they start using it, and then they go, you know what? It'd be great if we could have our fifth graders mentor our kindergartners. Can we just pick up their whole room, which is for them to move it over here. You can't do that. People can move around, right? You can make those units irreplaceable, but in software, we can do that. We can refactor, we can revise. So it's kind of frustrating when we get asked to completely overhaul what we're doing, but we have the freedom and flexibility to adapt as we discover that things are being used in different ways.
I believe that conceptually, and it does happen. Refactoring is an important part of the business. But I think also if you look at some of the research that's going on in various, in academic and industrial environments, a lot of it is about trying to take old software and turning it into newer software that's better and safer and cleaner and so forth. And people find it very hard to do.
Like banks running COBOL, they can't find COBOL engineers to run banking systems.
I think that's one example. There was a DARPA program from a few years ago called VSpells. I don't remember what it stands for, but it was focused on being able to take older C and C++ code and turn it into modern systems and trying to find techniques for making that at least possible, if not efficient.
Or like the unemployment, I think in agency, what is SSI? I can't remember what the name of the federal organization is, but apparently all their software is all super old COBOL and junk like that, and they can't find anybody to work on it. Seems kind of sad. My grandfather wrote Octal, and he always would say, "Oh yeah, that was running continuously for 30 years." It's like, wow, it'd be nice if my software ran continuously for 5 years.
Yeah, some of these systems have pretty remarkable lifetimes, but it's also pretty clear that a lot of them reach a point where they're really not achieving the things that they were designed to do, or not achieving the things that they need to do now.
Mm. So, I think you had some questions that I trampled on. I want to go back to your questions, but when you ask, can we build software like an assembly line? I can't help but think, who would want that? Who benefits from that?
So I think that's really the motivation for asking the question originally, because I think who benefits from it is probably not engineers. It's probably the businesses. The whole point of assembly lines in manufacturing was that you could use less specialized people. And I think that's probably true to a large extent in software as well. And let's face it, if you're an engineer, if you can find a process where you can get from inception to product faster, then that's the process you should be using if you are serious about your profession.
Hmm.
So the idea, if this were to work, is that you could have people with less broad knowledge, probably people who are less expensive to build the steps in the process, so that you don't have to have, every engineer you hire doesn't have to have knowledge of front end and databases and distributed systems and other back end concerns.
It seems like if you could leach some of the creative freedom or creative potential out of some of these tasks, they would get more dull, but possibly cheaper to perform. And I can see from a business owner's perspective, and actually from my perspective, I look at software development, I think, why is it so expensive? A buddy of mine wants to start a technology based company. He's not, he has no software background. He got a quote to build a prototype website, 3 to 6 months, $100,000. And I look at that and I think, yeah, I can easily imagine how you could spend that for consulting contract. But then I also look at it and think, that's a ton of money for his prototype web application that's got, like half a dozen pages of forms. It's not going to be used by more than a dozen people to start out with. Why is it so expensive? Can we get it to be cheaper?
I agree. It does seem both perfectly in line with what your expectations would be and also probably too much.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't really know what the answer is there, but I do feel like this is probably stuff that's coming.
Hmm.
The maybe it's artificial intelligence somehow augments these steps. Maybe it's that there's bigger uptake of formal methods. We've heard about people using TLA plus, and there seems to be at least certain organizations that have adopted things like OCaml and Haskell, and there's some enthusiasm for Rust in various quarters. I think that the argument against those types of things at the moment is that they take too much time and are probably unnecessary for the majority of products, because most of those products are not going to kill anybody if they give you the wrong answer.
Mm. Mm.
But I think as time goes by and the computers can sort of help us with those tasks of building formal models, maybe those things start to slip into the pipelines. And
And you say not going to kill anybody because formal methods are used in aviation, right? Like that's where you have life and death on the line for your software.
yeah, people are using either formal methods or other sorts of very strict approaches for things like aviation, medical devices, cryptography for military applications and things like that, where the possibility of having bugs and other types of flaws is just unacceptable.
Hmm.
So, but if your photos from your weekend at the beach don't upload to Instagram correctly, nobody really cares.
Hmm. So you don't need formal methods for that. I had a feeling that large language models, AI tools, were looming on the outside, the sort of boundaries of this question that you had. When you read the New York Times piece, it's talking about the writers' strike. It's talking about how they're trying to sort of take leach out some of the creative requirements involved in producing content for television and movies. And I look at that and think, what? That's crazy. And the writer's strike, I mean, crazy is like, how would you do that? And the writer's strike is about, we don't really want you to mix up our work with these AI tools. It kind of dumbs it down. And so suddenly that does make me think of an assembly line. Because when I think of an assembly line, I think of humans. Assembly line development is possible because there's this inner exchange between humans and machines, right? And you brought up precision, and precisions are necessary for machines, maybe. So, like, as I have machines to augment the work I'm doing, I could sort of increase my throughput as a worker because machines are complementing the work I do, and maybe that's what AI or LLMs are going to be for us. And it reminds me of like here in San Diego, we have a whole community of people who build surfboards, and they are called surfboard shapers, and they have very traditional crafts people tools. Like they use these planers. The famous Skill 100 is this planer that people, they don't make anymore, but people love this thing. And in the 90s there was this resistance to having programmed templates which produce a machine. I call them pop outs, and then the shaper is no longer like guiding the imperfect flow of a surfboard. They're really just cleaning up what the machine did. That seems like an analogy for this. You have an LLM just crap out some work, and then the software developer has to clean it up and make sure that it fits together with existing stuff. Is that kind of what you're hinting at with AI? And maybe formal methods is a way of saying, did it actually do what I thought? So that's I don't even have to check it anymore. I just sort of, I take these units of code that are vomited out by a large language model. I clean it up, I sand down the rough parts, feed it into formal methods. Formal methods says, yes, this does what we think. And boom, my job is done. I go to lunch.
In part, yeah, I there's it's hard for me to make a perfect parallel with surfboard shaping, I admit. But to be clear, also, I don't think that there's necessarily ever going to be an end to creative processes in building either software or movies and TV shows. I think there's always going to be this market for quirky indie movies that
Hmm.
probably are beyond the beyond the abilities of a of an assembly line approach to produce. And similarly, there's always going to be innovative ideas that come out of software that were not. Maybe the LLMs do come up with interesting algorithms or interesting ideas, but I think there will always be things that humans write that are creative and interesting.
Hmm.
But I also think you have to accept that a pretty large fraction of what gets produced in the software world is not especially novel.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. That goes back to that
there,
question is, well, why is it so not? Why does it feel like every request is novel if what we're building really stuff that exists?
I'm not sure, and there's a sense I've had for a long time that there's just a huge number of variations on what the industry calls CRUD applications,
Hmm.
and if you look at a travel site or a social media site, it feels like a lot of it is just entering data, uploading data, downloading data, and one wonders why we need as many engineers as we have in the world to produce that kind of stuff.
Yeah, you use the acronym CRUD. I just wanted to explode that. It's create, read, update, delete. We use that for talking about what websites often do with the data you enter into them.
Right. And it feels like a lot of the stuff we interact with on a day to day basis is essentially that. I
Hmm.
mean, there's obviously some useful stuff. I'm super reliant on Google Maps these days, which is an interesting and sophisticated application.
Hmm.
But so much of what is available on commercial websites as well as in-house web applications seems to have quite a lot of commonality.
Hmm. Are there areas of this question you think we haven't in mind or haven't explored, like other places we need to take it before we fairly address the question if you could build assembly line software by assembly line?
I guess one question I sort of had for you, since you have a better handle on this than I do, is that do you think that the CI/CD pipelines that we build are a step in this direction, or is it a completely different thing?
Oh, that's interesting. I was kind of wondering because I think I might have this wrong, but I thought I read once that one of Henry Ford's original ideas, he's credited with creating the assembly line, which revolutionized manufacturing, was to use a conveyor belt. And the conveyor belt moves the work to the worker, and the worker stays in place and just does the work, and they can focus on one or two tasks. And then so I wondered, what does it mean to move the work to the worker in the case of software? I don't know if CI/CD really fits in that conveyor belt type of analogy because it's more of a delivery mechanism, right? It's like I can finish it and ship it. Shipping is a nice metaphor. Shipping, you put it in a box, you put it on a truck or a train or a cargo ship, and it goes out somewhere in the world. Um, it is nice to not think about the shipment of it. I can just sort of like put my signature on it, and poof, it magically goes out into the world. That doesn't quite feel the same as an assembly line to me. Assembly line, if it got shipped to me automatically, if the work got moved to me automatically somehow, a conveyor belt of software.
You had said something earlier about how we have specialists who do QA, and what occurred to me is that in the world of CI/CD, oh, by the way, that means continuous integration, continuous delivery. I guess we
Yeah,
probably should
right.
have
So like
mentioned
you're
that as
constantly
well.
testing this stuff. Every time you write it, it gets tested, and then
Um,
you sort of click a button, and it automatically gets blended with the existing stuff and shipped out to the world continuously. Continuous delivery. Yes. Sorry. Go ahead.
so, when I was a newbie back in the day, QA was sort of a step in the assembly line. You'd figure out some way to get your changes onto a QA environment, and that was essentially off hands to you as an engineer, and the QA team would test on that machine and they would give you feedback on what worked and what failed and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
So it really was sort of a step in a in an almost assembly line like process. So, but now, there's this idea that you don't want to stop the process for somebody to QA it before it goes into potentially a production system. So the pipeline moves everything into into the production world, and then there has to be some sort of checking or feature flagging to make sure that things still work.
Go
So I
fast and
guess,
break things, I think is what you're saying. Just go out there, go fast as you can, break stuff.
yeah. So I wonder if there is sort of a assembly line analogy here. It's just that the the worker on the assembly line is not so much any longer a human being as it is some sort of agent, which is checking things that have been deployed to make sure that they still work.
Hmm. We covered a lot of ground here. I gotta say, I feel dissatisfied by how much I can. By looking at things like why is it so expensive? Why does it take so long? Why don't I know how long it's going to take? And I build this stuff. Why don't I know how long it's going to take? That's annoying to me. I, I thought you were going to help me answer these questions. I'm so disappointed.
I agree with you about the disappointment. Um, I've been doing this for 40 years, and it mystifies me as to why estimation in particular has not gotten better. I guess in a partially it's because agile methods sort of discourage the entire concept, but it just seems like it's something that people should be trying to figure out,
Hmm.
even if it turns out that it is an impossible project. It's such a it's such a failure of our industry, I think, to not be able to give better sense of how long a project is going to take and how much it's going to cost.
Yeah. There must be something fundamental in what we're doing that makes it very hard. I guess as a kind of summing from this conversation, when I think about the history of our field, what we do, you could almost draw a spectrum of how much we have tried to make it like assembly lines and how much we've reacted against that. So you could almost put waterfall as like, let's do this like an assembly line. And the reaction, the hatred for waterfall is, no, 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 that sucks. Let's stop doing that. And then maybe increasing specialization is bouncing back that way. And maybe there are continually reactions against it. No, this is fundamentally creative work. Leave me alone. I'll tell you when it's done.
Yeah, I mean, I think I personally have spent most of my career in the mindset of this is a craftsman like profession, and people should just accept that and live with it and try to improve it and do it as well as possible. It's probably only been the last decade or so where I've started to question whether or not that's the best paradigm.
Hmm.
Um,
You
and I
sympathize
guess,
too much with the owners now, business owners.
yeah, it's probably because I'm old and conservative now, but I just feel like we should probably be doing this better. We should probably be doing less duplication.
Hmm.
We should probably be doing more. We should probably have better ideas about correctness of what we're doing.
Yeah, I think you're right.
And it feels to me like we've made relatively little progress on any of those issues during my roughly 40-year career.
And selfishly, as someone who enjoys writing software because I get to just solve puzzles in my little cave all day, and I really like that, I'm happy for somebody to come to me and knock on my door and say, "Can you solve this puzzle?" And I'll be like, "Yeah, I'll solve it for you. I'll let you know when it's done. Bye." It's very similar when I go order. If I go to my local shaper and I order a surfboard, can you make me a surfboard? Well, yeah, I'll try to get it done within the next 6 months. The 6 months come by and I'm like, "Is your artwork done? Can I put it out in the ocean yet?" And they're like, "No." And I'm like, "Okay, that's how it goes."
Yeah, I very much am with you on that in the sense that I was at this same stage for a long time, which is I just like to sit in my cube and write code and solve people's problems. But I think you reach a point where you have heard all the problems, and doing them the second time or the third time ceases to be nearly as interesting, and you start to ask yourself, why am I doing this for a third time?
How did I even get here? Okay, I think that's probably a good place to end our conversation. Thanks for bringing that question, Mike. It is an interesting question. I don't feel like we resolved it. But now I think when I go to work, I'm going to be like, why am I doing the same problem over and over again? Thanks, Mike, for drawing the mystery and the fun out of solving the same problems. I'm your host, Erik Aker, my co host, Mike Mull. This is Picture Me Coding.
See you next time.
Bye bye.
Bye.